In the heart of Nigeria, in a small, bustling village called Okadu, lived a young woman named Adebimp. She was the daughter of a widowed mother, a dunny, who struggled to make ends meet. They lived in a small, thatched roof hut, and while they weren't poor in the sense of being destitute, life was far from luxurious. Every day, Adebimp helped her mother tend to their farm, cultivating crops like cassava, yams, and maize. Adebimp was known for her beauty and intelligence, and despite their circumstances, she carried herself with grace. She had dreams of leaving the village, perhaps moving to Lagos to find work, or even further, to travel the world. But her reality was tethered to the farm and the village life, at least for now. One day, a man named Tunde arrived in the village. He was tall, well-built, with a mysterious air about him. He was new to Okadu, and no one seemed to know where he had come from or what brought him to the village. His clothes were plain but neat, and he carried himself with an understated confidence that was hard to miss. Tunde was a quiet man, often seen walking around the village with a book in his hand or sitting by the river, lost in thought. Word spread quickly that Tunde was a successful businessman, though no one knew for sure what his business entailed. Some said he worked in construction, others believed he was involved in tech. The most popular rumor was that he was a contractor for major oil companies. Whatever it was, he was said to be wealthy, though he never flaunted it. Adebimp first met Tunde on a market day, when she was buying some items for her mother. He stood quietly by a stall, watching the traders. She noticed him immediately, drawn to the calm aura that surrounded him. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and there was something magnetic about their connection, though neither spoke. She went on with her shopping, but his image lingered in her mind. The next few days were filled with whispers in the village. Tunde had begun taking an interest in Adebimp. He would come to her mother's farm, offering to help with the labor, something that was rare in Okadu where most of the men were too busy with their own farms or work. His offers seemed innocent enough, but Adebimp was skeptical. She didn't want to get involved with someone who seemed too good to be true, especially given their difference in status. But Tunde was persistent. He helped her and her mother with their farm, never asking for anything in return. Slowly, Adebimp began to warm to him. He was kind, thoughtful, and seemed genuinely interested in her life. He would share stories of places he had visited, of cities far beyond the village borders, of a life that seemed so distant from hers. She found herself fascinated by him, by his knowledge, and by the way he made her feel, seen and valued. After a few months, the village chief, Baba Alade, called Adebimp's mother to a meeting. Rumors had begun to spread about the growing closeness between Adebimp and Tunde, and some of the elders were worried. They believed that Adebimp was not being careful enough about whom she was associating with. Baba Alade, a man of many words and little action, insisted that Adebimp should marry someone from their village, someone they knew, someone they could trust. It wasn't long before Adebimp's mother was pressurized into agreeing. They believed it was time for Adebimp to settle down, and though she was reluctant, she could see no way out. The village men began to approach her, seeking her hand, and though none of them had the same charm or intellect as Tunde, they were familiar faces, men who had lived in Okadu all their lives. One evening, Adebimp was told that her fate had been sealed. She was to marry a local farmer, Ayatunde, a hard-working, honest man, but one with little means and no dreams of leaving the village. Her heart sank. She had hoped that Tunde would ask for her hand, but he had never expressed any such intention. Instead, she had been placed into a marriage with a man she barely knew, forced by the pressure of her community. The wedding was a simple affair. The entire village gathered in the small clearing by the river to witness the union. Adebimp couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the life she had envisioned for herself. She stood at the altar, wearing a modest white gown, her mind wandering as Ayatunde smiled at her with such genuine affection. Yet, as she exchanged vows with Ayatunde, her thoughts were not of him, but of Tunde. Where had he gone? Why had he disappeared from her life without a trace? Weeks passed, and Adebimp tried to make the best of her situation. She worked alongside Ayatunde, helping him tend to their small plot of land, but there was no spark, no connection. Her heart was not in it. Every day felt like a weight on her chest. One morning, just as she was about to leave for the market, a black SUV pulled up outside their modest home. The dust from the dirt road settled as the door opened, and Tunde stepped out, dressed in a sharp suit, his presence commanding attention. Adebimp's heart raced as he walked toward her, his face lit up with a smile that made her knees weak. Bimp, he said, his voice calm but filled with warmth, I've been looking for you. Confused, she looked back at Ayatunde, who was standing in the doorway with a blank expression. Why? Why didn't you tell me who you really are? Bimp's voice trembled. Tunde smiled. I didn't want you to marry me because of what I could give you. I wanted you to choose me because of who I am. His words hit her like a thunderclap, and she felt the weight of them in her chest. Before she could respond, Tunde turned to Ayatunde, offering him a firm handshake. I know you've taken good care of her, but I cannot let her go without a fight, he said, his voice firm, but respectful. Bimp's world turned upside down. Here, in front of her, stood the men she had secretly longed for, the men who had disappeared without a word, revealing his true identity as a billionaire. Tunde owned numerous businesses in Lagos and had connections that reached across the world, far beyond anything the small village of Okadu could comprehend. Tunde's wealth was unimaginable to the villagers. His investments in oil, tech, and real estate had made him one of the richest men in Nigeria. But his wealth wasn't what drew him to Bimp, it was her heart, her intelligence, and her kind spirit that had captivated him from the very first moment he saw her. Bimp was torn between her duty to her community, the life she had known, and the promise of a different future, a future with Tunde that could take her far beyond the boundaries of Okadu. As Tunde stood there, waiting for Bimp to respond, the tension in the air was thick. Ayatunde, who had been quiet up until now, finally spoke. Bimp, he said, his voice softer than usual, but with a hint of resolve, I may not have the wealth that this man has, but I have always cared for you. I will always care for you. His words were sincere, but they were no match for the storm of emotion swirling inside Bimp. She turned to Ayatunde, the man she had married out of obligation, and for the first time, truly looked at him. He was kind, dependable, but there was a quiet resignation in his eyes, as though he had always known this day would come, the day when someone else would sweep her away from him. She felt a pang of guilt for the pain she knew she had caused him, but her heart ached for a different kind of future, one she had never imagined but now could not ignore. She looked back at Tunde, who stood waiting for her answer, his calm demeanor betraying the storm of feelings she could sense behind his composed exterior. She remembered all the quiet moments they had shared, the walks by the river, his gentle smile, and the way he had made her feel seen when no one else had. Her heart was torn in two. How could she abandon the men who had been there for her, who had always been loyal and kind? Yet, how could she deny the promise of a life that stretched beyond the limits of her village, a life that Tunde offered her, one filled with excitement, adventure, and opportunities she had once only dreamed of? Bimp, Tunde said again, softly this time, I don't want you to choose me because of the life I can offer you. I want you to choose me because you see something in me that you can't find in anyone else. I know this is hard, and I'm asking a lot of you. But the future I want is one with you by my side, not just as my wife, but as my partner. Tears filled Bimp's eyes as she stood between the two men, one who had loved her from afar, and one who had loved her up close, despite all the circumstances. The world felt like it was closing in on her, but in that moment, she knew there was only one decision she could make. It wasn't about wealth or status, it wasn't about the promises of a better life. It was about the kind of love that could make her feel free, the kind of love that would push her to become her best self. Taking a deep breath, she spoke, her voice trembling but clear. Tunde, she said, turning toward him, I cannot pretend that this isn't the hardest decision I've ever had to make. I can't deny that there is a part of me that has always wondered what a life with you could be like. She paused, her heart racing. But I owe it to Ayatunde, to the man who has always been here for me, to be honest with myself. I am his wife, and I have made a VO. Bimp turned to face Ayatunde, her gaze softening. Ayatunde, I will always respect you, and I will always be grateful for your kindness. I never intended to hurt you. I want to be fair to you, just as much as I want to be fair to myself. Ayatunde nodded, his face a mixture of sadness and understanding. Bimp, you deserve the world, he said quietly. If it's Tunde who can give that to you, then go. I won't hold you back. With that, Tunde stepped forward, and gently took Bimp's hand. She felt the weight of the decision lift slightly as they walked away, the village fading behind them. They didn't speak much on the journey, there was no need for words. Bimp knew, deep down, that she had made the right choice, even though it had cost her the familiarity of her old life. Months passed, and Bimp settled into a new world with Tunde. They moved to Lagos, where Tunde's businesses were based, and Adebimp found herself immersed in a life she had never imagined. The luxury, the travel, the new friends, they were all overwhelming at first. But Tunde remained the calm anchor in her life, supporting her as she navigated this new chapter. Despite the wealth and prestige, Tunde never changed. He remained the same quiet, introspective man who had first captured her heart in the village. Together, they built a life filled with love, respect, and shared dreams. Tunde never asked her to leave behind who she was. Instead, he embraced her for the woman she had always been, the woman who had worked the land and shared stories under the stars. As time went on, Adebimp found herself flourishing in ways she had never expected. She became involved in several charitable organizations, particularly those that supported rural women and farmers in villages like Okadu. Her heart, once heavy with the weight of her decisions, now felt full as she used her voice and her newfound influence to help others. Adebimp and Tunde's love grew deeper with every passing year, and while their life was far removed from the village she had once known, she never forgot the lessons of humility and gratitude that it had taught her. She and Tunde traveled the world, seeing places she had only dreamed of. Yet, in the quiet moments at home, she still found herself grateful for the village where it all began. And so, Adebimp's life, once dictated by the expectations of her community, blossomed into one of her own making. She had found not just a love story, but a partnership that allowed her to grow, to thrive, and to become the woman she had always dreamed of, someone strong, independent, and loved deeply. The journey wasn't easy, but as she stood beside Tunde, watching the sun set over the Lagos skyline, Adebimp knew one thing for certain: no matter how her story had begun, it was only the beginning of the life she was meant to live. And so, their story continued, not defined by the past, but by the future they were building together. We have gotten to the end of this video. Kindly like and subscribe for more.